Contrary to what you might hear, you absolutely do not need to break the bank in order to build a fairly effective and fun deck in Lorcana. What you see on screen here is my first attempt at building a $50 budget deck that utilizes some of the blue steel cards that focus on resist. These are some of the cards that aren't really played too much in the meta, so they are extremely cheap because they've kind of fallen off in price since they're not used in the meta decks. But in the right build and with the right combination, they can still be very effective. Now, if you're interested in some of the matches with this deck, check the timestamp below. And if you want to see this page, which is the Dreamborn deck list, make sure you also check the description for that link. What we tend to utilize though is some decent on-curve cards like the Jafar to handle any evasive threats that the opponent might throw down, a Prince Eric, which at a 1/3 challenger is an excellent 2-drop as well. You play a Hook, Forceful Duelist. These are all, again, just commons that are very, very cheap, but these are still very effective. And then you have a Shift Target in the Hook, Thinking a Happy Thought. Again, very, very cheap. And finally, on your top end, you utilize things like Tiana, which has resist +2. Again, super, super cheap because it's not really played in the meta, so the price has really fallen off. But it does quest for 2 and is very hard to out without direct removal. Your opponent is likely not beating over this thing, especially if you get out the Cogsworth Grandfather Clock, which is kind of what the deck revolves around. You get a couple of resist cards out on field, and then Cogsworth boosts them all up again by adding another resist. That means every time Tiana is challenged, if you have Tiana and Cogsworth, your opponent has to have more than 4 damage going into it in order to just deal 1 damage, because 3 damage, the first 3 damage on everything that your opponent tries to damage Tiana with will just be nullified by the resist ability between both Tiana and Cogsworth. On the top end, you also have a Tamatoa. Since this is a Sapphire deck, you are utilizing the Hiram Draw Engine, which is a fairly cheap card in and of itself for how good it is. And then you utilize a lot of nice items here. The Fishbone Quills have come down in price. They are maybe one of the more expensive cards in the deck, along with your removal in the Grab Your Swords and the Let It Goes. But overall, you're still under $50. So let's go ahead and take a look at some matches and see how this deck has performed. In this first matchup here, we're going up against Amber, Ruby, Mufasa, Highroll. We are going second, so you'll be able to see, can this budget deck really fare against what is becoming, I think, one of the, I don't want to say top meta contenders, but it's definitely a meta deck that has been gaining popularity. Speaking of which, they ink a $40 Maleficent, and I think our whole deck costs basically the price of one Maleficent, more or less, right? But they have no 1-drop, and they just pass on nothing. We go ahead and drop our Hook. Turn 2, they drop a Lantern, so they are valuing some ramp to try to drop some of their big characters. We're going to continue to play on curve, dropping a 2-drop Cogsworth on turn 2. And we do have double Prince Bodyguard, which will help allow us to quest safely next turn. The opponent reveals on turn 3 to drop a Dock, which will further reduce the cost of their characters in combination with that Lantern. So they're kind of, ramping, air quotes, but in the Amber way, not really in the Sapphire or traditional way. Nonetheless, we do follow through with our plan, playing again on curve on turn 3, dropping the Prince, which does have resist. There's no reason for this Dock to run into it, so if anything, they might just quest with it. But they don't have anything to reduce further, so they're just going to use Lantern to drop the Mufasa, and they end up passing without questing with the Dock. We're going to go ahead and ink a Hiram since we have 2, and we're going to shift the Cogsworth. This will now make our Prince have resist +2. Which is pretty strong because now they'll have to throw multiple bodies into it in order to take it off field. They go ahead and ink a Mini Surfer and then drop a Rockstar Stitch. So they are valuing digging for some cards, maybe dropping some low drop characters next turn, but also putting a lot of questing pressure on board now. They only quest with the Mufasa and pass because of course they want that Mufasa to get banished. But the funny thing about this deck is the Mufasa can only run into the Prince because of Bodyguard, and the Mufasa wouldn't get banished from it because it will only take 1 damage, and the Mufasa would only deal 1 damage back. So that's kind of funny. Because we dropped the second Cogsworth here, now the Prince has resist +3, which means everything the opponent currently has on board that has 3 or less strength will do 0 damage to the Prince. They cannot run over anything on my field, and therefore it's just a turn sideways match because we are already at 12, and next turn we're going to go up to 19. The opponent can only go up to 19 themselves next turn, having 10 questing pressure on board. So this means that unless they have something else to gain them 1 extra lore, and there's no shiftable targets that they can surprise us with, we've basically just outraced the Mufasa deck here because they absolutely could not out the Prince Bodyguard, and they couldn't get any removal. So just like that, you can see how this deck was able to aggro out and run over a deck that really couldn't take out our threats early on and therefore was unable to win this match. So we take this one pretty simply here. In this next matchup, we're going up against Emerald Steel Discard, also going second. And there is some anti-synergy with this deck with like the Beast Mirror and the Tiana and the Hurons, because you might not get as much utility off of Beast Mirror as you would like. But if you've ever watched my Ruby Sapphire videos, you know that I also include the Dinner Bell package in that deck, because to solely rely on Huron as your draw engine, if you don't see one, then you're kind of up a creek. So I always like to have a secondary draw engine, and since this is a budget deck, you're not using Whole New Worlds, so therefore Beast Mirror is a good second option. Worst case scenario, Beast Mirror is just a 2-cost inkable item that you can ink if you need it, or you can play it as an item to draw off Huron directly, or in the case that you don't see a Huron and you have like a Tiana setup in play, you can be drawing 2 cards a turn, once for the draw of the turn and then once again for Beast Mirror, in order to keep ink ramping and still have no cards in hand for Tiana. So while it may seem anti-synergistic, there is some synergy with this deck. Now this opponent was playing a little weird. My guess was they quested with everything, including their Bucky, to try to bait my Jafar to take a damage so that they could finish it with the Robin Hood, but it kind of backfired on them. They also missed an ink, and you'll see that they have a lot of uninkables in hand as they continue to play out their turns here. But they are going to be able to clear the Jafar with this hook shift. But the Jafar got pretty good value going 2 for, well, not 2 for 1, but going 1 for 1, and also dealing 3 damage to that hook, which will allow me to finish it off with this top deck to grab your swords. And against discard, if you don't get your advantage engine rolling, the deck just really falls apart, and this is the one detriment of discard, is that it really does lose to steal. Speaking of which, this budget deck, as I explained about how the card draw in this deck works for the different engines, works very, very well against discard. So if you hate playing against discard and you want to beat it, Beast Mirror directly counters discard, because you have no cards in hand. You draw with a Beast Mirror during your turn, you play out your hand, then you have no cards in hand again. The discard doesn't matter for the opponent. They don't get any advantage off of their Prince John, and therefore they're just playing off of the top decks because they have nothing in your hand to discard. And then of course you also have Huron, which you can draw cards with, as you can see us doing here. And overall, we're in total control of this match now. It's just a matter of establishing our board, setting up our game plan, because we've kind of outplayed the discard engine by outing both the Bucky and the Prince John thanks to the grab your swords. But yeah, the opponent really just has a bunch of uninkables in hand that they can't really do much with, so they're going to be stuck on 4 ink, whereas with us, we have draw engine, we have ink ramp, and this is why the more expensive version of Sapphire Steel was so good as well, because you had card draw and you had ink ramp. And so we can continue to just pump out a bunch of different threats on field, which is what you're going to see us do, utilizing that Fishbone Quill to continue to get a massive ink advantage. And now our board consists of a Tiana, a Huron, a Nick Wilde, and a Cogsworth, which is 7 questing power on board. We don't have a bodyguard, but we do have the resist +1 on all the characters except for the Cogsworth, which is nice. And right now, I mean, we're in such control, we're just going to clear the opponent's board here with double grab your swords, I think, and keep the let it go for whatever they might play next. Continue to quest and go for game here, because there's nothing the opponent can really do to play out of this situation on an Emerald Steel discard deck, and therefore this game is just about wrapped up. I might have one more match for you. Let's go ahead and take a look at that before we wrap up this video. Alright, in this final matchup here, we are going up against the dreaded Ruby Amethyst pairing. While this version is not necessarily the tier 0 version, it's a version that's focused more on evasives. It's still very powerful and can be difficult to deal with. So to start off, we're going to drop a Popsicle, the opponent reveals a Goofy, and then passes with no turn 1 play. Instead of playing the Eric here, because I saw that Goofy, I decided to wait and not try to establish a board just yet. The opponent reveals a Pinocchio, and again, these aren't huge threats, so I'm fine actually inking my Eric, because I think that in this matchup it may not be so useful. I was kind of, after seeing the Goofy, on the impression that the opponent might be focused on evasives, and you know, everybody plays Minnie Mouse, but the difference is, will they be playing more Goofies and Pongos, and you'll find out later on. But the opponent is establishing a bit of a board, and good thing I did ink that Eric, because in this matchup it would prove to be quite useless, since anything can take out that Pinocchio and the Eric cannot deal with evasives. So I end up drawing into 2 more Fishbone Quills there and inking them both, which is fine as long as you're going to keep one of them on field, knowing that Ruby Amethyst has no way to interact with your items. As long as you don't banish it with your own Hiram, you should be safe. Now I make a misplay here in hindsight because I should probably have played that last cannon for 1 and used that to banish off the Hiram draw so I could keep my Fishbone Quill. So slight misplay in hindsight on that one, because you just want to have that ink ramp available to you if you can. But I'm going to go ahead and start questing now and establish my Prince Bodyguard. I end up dropping the Beast Mirror and the Mouse Armor, so my Prince Eric has +2 resist. Or sorry, not Prince Eric, the Prince. The opponent does reveal they're on more evasive, dropping a Pongo on turn 4. Now they're at 7 lore, which is pretty problematic because they can run away with this game very, very quickly. We're going to go ahead though and shift our top decked Cogsworth onto the existing Cogsworth, use the Mouse Armor on it so that we can take out the Tremaine and only take 1 damage. Then we quest with the Hiram and banish that Mouse Armor, which again in hindsight you can say you could banish the Beast Mirror. Another reason why Beast Mirror is not necessarily a detriment in this deck, you can just use it on the Hiram if you have one. But I opt to keep it around, and we opt to drop yet another Cogsworth. So now our Prince has resist +3, which means that nothing the opponent has is really going to take it out. But at this point, you kind of have to recognize that the game plan of the opponent is not to deal with my board, it is to just outrace me. And so with that in mind, we are going to do our best to try and establish a bit of a wider board if we can. And thankfully, we draw into an inkable off of this Popsicle, and we're going to be able to drop the Tiana. In hindsight, again, I should not have played this Grab Your Sword because there's no way my opponent was dropping like a crab to beef up one of their evasive threats to throw into my Prince. Because I do have game on board after I quest here, I might as well just have quested with the Cogsworth. But again, we have 11 questing power on board, so unless the opponent was really going to be able to take out my Prince, we had game anyway, so singing that Grab Your Swords ends up being inconsequential in the end. The opponent establishes quite a wide evasive board, but as soon as I see him questing and not challenging, I realize that I have game because I have the quest to 20 on board. And just like that, you're able to outrace your opponents by flooding the board and drawing cards, and that's why this budget deck can be so effective. If you've made it this far in the video, please leave a like if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment letting me know what you think. If you would like to see more of these budget videos with different color combinations, let me know and I'll be happy to experiment and see what I can come up with. So once again, thank you again if you've made it this far. Thank you for watching. Quantum is out.